Chapter, what are we on? Chapter 16, I believe we are. We talk about unfair competition and antitrust laws and what goes on there. That's kind of the news today was that Janet Reno had passed away, and you guys wouldn't remember Janet Reno, but she was head of the Department of Justice, or the Attorney General, and presided over, I guess, one of the bigger cases that had to do with antitrust, which in recent time anyhow, which was Microsoft, and again something that was before most of your time. But it was a huge case that had to do with antitrust law, and so her passing today, interesting, I guess, or coincidental that we're starting this chapter. So things that we're going to do, right? Talk a little bit about the economic assumptions, right? We'll talk about the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, a few other things in there, and ultimately to remind you just how gray law is, and maybe in particular antitrust law. So here we go. So why do we study it, or why do we look at it? Is it just the big companies? Those are the ones that we read about, but no, the truth is antitrust types of violations can occur at any level, big, small, geographically, east, west, north, south, big companies, small companies, whatever the case may be, right? Violations can be serious, right? There could be loss of jobs, we could close down businesses, we could do all kinds of things, including, if it's actually criminal, we can put people in jail. So what happened? Originally, I like to describe it like this, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but that's how I imagine it. The old guys sitting around back in the day before TV and internet and all those other things, so they were drinking cognac or brandy maybe, and smoking cigars at the club, talking about stuff, and a lot of them were in the same businesses, and while they were sitting there, talking and drinking and smoking, they said, hey, we could probably make more money if we quit competing against each other. And so what we'll do is we'll transfer the stock of our various companies into trusts, and we'll have those trusts managed by trustees that will manage it in an effort. Obviously, there'll be trustees that we select, and they'll manage it in a manner that will allow us to maximize our profits, right? And those trusts became large, and they became aggressive, and they squeezed out the competitors. They did all of those things which were kind of nasty, I guess, at the time. And at the time, a lot of them oil was just kind of getting up and getting going, and a lot of them were kind of related to that oil industry. So, but news, we had news, and those accounts started to upset the public, right? And in 1890 then, Congress responded with the Sherman Act. It was the first antitrust law here in the United States, the first specific antitrust law. So this guy, he wasn't the president during the enactment of the Sherman Act, but he was the first president to actually actively pursue breakup. Hopefully you guys recognize him as Teddy Roosevelt, President of the United States, right? They called him the Trust Buster. He was also famous for saying, speak softly but carry a big stick, and that was partly in response to the big corporations and whatnot that he did break up using the Sherman Act, right? So the Sherman Antitrust, here's a little bit of history, was 1890, and in 1914 then the Clayton Act came along, and it established one of those agencies that we've talked about, but the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. There were amendments after the fact, and we don't spend a lot of time, I don't think, talking about the amendments. But certainly we talk about both the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act because both are still very prominent in antitrust and in kind of different ways. This one's more merger, and this one's more kind of after the fact. So economic assumptions are many small competitors are better than a few large ones. Generally speaking, in our society, we think competition is good, and when we get somebody or some company that monopolizes things, we tend to think that that's bad. Okay? And so we tend to like to see many small competitors. It doesn't happen in all cases. In some cases, that might be inefficient. We for example, in most of Montana, we get most of us get our power from Northwestern Energy, which, like in Havre, for example, does have a monopoly, and that's why it's regulated. It's a regulated monopoly, it's called. And so monopolies do exist, and sometimes that's just because the competition would be difficult in those cases. Imagine if you had to have 13 different natural gas pipelines to your house. Yeah, might be a little bit difficult, right? No organization or individual should control, right, production quantities or set prices. So two different schools of thought. The Chicago school, which I tend to think of as considered a very conservative school, they say efficiency is the key consideration. So monopolies by themselves may not be bad as long as we have efficiency. The Harvard school, a little more to the left, says don't allow domination by one participant in the market. So they're a little more proactive, saying that monopolies by themselves can be bad. Again, unless maybe they're regulated monopolies where there might be some necessity to it. Trains coming through northern Montana are, kind of a similar situation, right? I don't know if the pricing and whatnot's controlled there, but they certainly kind of have a monopoly on transport of freight and whatnot up in this area, with some competition from trucking, of course. But so the Sherman Act, right? It said that there's trust and trustees. But we still call it antitrust law, but today it's not necessarily, these things are not necessarily set up in trust. That's just how the name came about, but they're not necessarily. We'll go after corporations whose stock are not necessarily in trust and probably are not in trust, right? Things that then become important, and this is probably the biggest, term here, is restraint of trade. Anything that restrains trade, okay, is going to be looked at and should be looked at. Right? That can be contracts, combinations, or conspiracies. Often those may be horizontal, meaning between competitors, but sometimes vertical too, where manufacturer to retailer, manufacturer to wholesaler to retailer. There may be things there that can create, conspiracies that might lead to price fixing, but ultimately that might lead to restraint of trade, and that's bad. Okay, price fixing is bad, and think, even a small town, if you had two gas stations, and they decided to set and they had a monopoly right in that town, and 50 miles from the nearest town, and they decided to set the price of gasoline, and they sit down at the bar and discuss that every week. That would technically be price fixing, and that happens, certainly in the smaller bases, and a lot of times they probably get away with it in the small towns like that. But certainly, it happens in bigger cases too, and it's not allowed. Right? Price fixing just simply isn't allowed. To be a monopoly and be considered bad, of course, it has to be a deliberate action, and there has to be predatory conduct. So we see firms that in some ways gain monopolies or become monopolies. That was the big deal with Microsoft back in the day. Again, before most of your time, but Microsoft had operating systems on, I think at one time, about 95% of all personal computers. You bought a computer and it came with a Microsoft operating system back when they had MS-DOS and then the earlier Windows versions. That was it. And of course, everybody had PCs. PCs were the way to do business, and whether you're home and get on the internet, whatever the case may be. Okay, but Microsoft wasn't necessarily deliberate, and nor had they necessarily been predatory in their conduct. They were just very competitive and got to that point. Obviously, things have changed, and so going back to that case, It went on for a long time, years and years and years and years, and Microsoft argued, and I think correctly, at least when we look back, is that the computer world was changing so rapidly that even though they had a monopoly for that short period of time, it was irrelevant, because 10 years from then the market was going to be completely different, and of course history's proven them to be absolutely correct, that here we are now. PC sales are stagnant, if not falling a little bit. People have gone more towards tablets, smartphones, those types of things that are dominated by other actors. Okay, so there's kind of a couple analysis, right? The rule of reason says test of reasonableness, nature, character of contract, surrounding circumstances. So a lot of stuff falls in this rule of reason, and this is all the gray area stuff. Okay, so there are things that are per se illegality, but the gray area stuff falls under this rule of reason, and the courts then look at those on a case-by-case basis, obviously. So per se illegality is things that are just absolute, right? And we'll talk about some of those things here in a bit. So three elements for antitrust. This isn't either one of those per se, or rule of reasonableness. These are just three elements that have to be present for a case, I guess, an antitrust case to be brought against a company or companies. First, there has to be a combination, contract, or conspiracy. It has to create an unreasonable restraint of trade. And it has to involve interstate commerce, which, as we know, is defined very, very broadly. Again, the per se illegality, and there's a quick look, which is kind of in the middle between the rule of reasonableness and the per se illegality. So here's the per se standard, right? Over time, courts have judged that certain things are, so anti-competitive that they automatically then would be considered illegal. Price fixing, again, that's the two gas station example. Tying arrangements, and tying arrangements would be that's really what the Department of Justice went after Microsoft for, was because when you bought a PC back in the day, it automatically came loaded with I think it was the predecessor to Internet Explorer, and it did then, because that was already on your computer. People obviously went that direction when they were using a browser, and there were other browsers that existed in the day, Netscape and a couple others I can't remember. And that, did that force some of them out of business? Perhaps, right? And so that was kind of the tying arrangement that they went after Microsoft for. Group boycotts are when, a couple of companies might go together then and boycott maybe a manufacturer or wholesaler, unless they refuse to sell to another competitor. Would be a group boycott. I don't know if we see a lot of those. And then dividing markets, that you might see where companies get together and say, well, here, I'll tell you what, you stay west of the Mississippi and we'll stay east of the Mississippi, and that way we won't have the competition, right? And so we'll divide the market that way. And the markets wouldn't necessarily have to be geographic. They could be demographic or other ways that you might be dividing the market there. So the Sherman Act is when the Department of Justice gets involved, and so there can certainly be fines and imprisonment. The courts get involved in Sherman Act things. Okay, we'll see with the federal or with the Clayton Act that that's not necessarily the case. Okay, so the courts can get involved. It can be, again, the standard of proof, preponderance of evidence, as if it's a civil case, and beyond a reasonable doubt would be if it's a criminal case, which of course we've talked about quite a bit. There can be triple damages. Can be, that's not automatic, but there can be. Probably depends again on a case-by-case basis, and property can be subject to seizure and forfeiture. We see this huge spike, right, in antitrust things in 1999, and a lot of you were too young to remember, but that was the dot-com bubble. We saw this dot-com bubble where anything that was related to the internet just went up in price just like something crazy. Everybody was buying it and stocks went crazy, and there's lots of mergers and acquisitions going on, and there was all kinds of those antitrust cases back then. Same thing here. Now these are total incarcerations, so you're not seeing, really a ton of people, that are actually getting put away for things that have to do with antitrust. Just not that many. There are exemptions. Okay, so Congress got together and said, there may be some things here that need to be monopolies. Okay. Or that it makes sense to be monopolies. Insurance companies can be one of those, and I think again that may be insurance companies that cover certain demographics, certain geographic areas, certain product lines, those types of things. They kind of allow that. Farm cooperatives, as you might imagine, in small rural areas, that might be the only business there that's providing some of those services, and so they allow them. And these aren't automatic exemptions. So when I say they're exempt, they're not automatic exemptions. Again, if they're doing some things to restrain trade, if they're fighting to keep competitors out of those markets, probably not good. But if they if they do have a monopoly and they're doing business and they're doing those types of things, it may be okay. Shipping, again, in certain areas, shipping. Truck line, between Las Vegas and LA would not be exempt, right? They would be subject to. But when you talk about the railroad coming through the northern tier, do we want 4 railroads coming through that same area? Yeah, maybe not, right? Milk marketing, for whatever reason, I don't know. Investment companies, again, I kind of don't know why those are set up. Again, maybe providing certain products, covering certain demographics or certain things like that. States, okay, and this was the case, the Parker versus Brown said, so states themselves can engage in monopolistic activities, and that's fine. Labor unions doing normal activities. Our faculty union, we just have one, and that's considered okay. Major League Baseball, crazy. I think that came about, I don't know, a long time ago, and there was actually a competitor league that formed, and the competitor league was around for a few years, and then it went broke, and it sued Major League Baseball, saying that Major League Baseball, MLB, was predatory, and that it had striven to drive the new league out of business, and on and on, and as the case was going through the courts, it looked like the new league was going to win, and Congress kind of stepped in and said, well, baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet, I mean, those things are all American, and so we'll, we're going to allow an exemption for Major League Baseball. And actually, the other major sports have similar types of exemptions. And the Norr-Pennington, I think it was an act or law, whichever the case is, but it allowed immunity for lobbying. So companies could go together, if they were in the same industry and they were lobbying Congress or states, they could go together and maybe hire one lobbyist if their interests were the same, and that wouldn't be considered an activity that was restraint of trade. So again, types of cases, we can have price fixing, which can be horizontal between competitors, okay? And that's a per se illegality. The vertical one would be one that comes under the rule of reasonableness. Okay? And they talk a little bit about the Colgate Doctrine, and the Colgate Doctrine really says that the manufacturers can, they can set prices, they can tell retailers what, minimum price that they want theirs sold for, or perhaps a maximum price that they would allow their product to be sold. But they can't coerce or pressure otherwise, right? If they're doing that, then it might be considered a violation. But again, that would be under the rule of reasonableness under a case-by-case basis. Okay, and we get to territorial agreements, and it's similar. You got horizontal, really, and vertical here. So you got, again, if we were dividing up space, geographic areas, that would certainly be a per se violation. But the vertical, and think about like car dealerships. They limit the number of dealers to a certain area. That's kind of okay. Okay, but there might be some other territorial agreements like that where it might not be okay. If this is, for competitive reasons and whatnot, may be okay. And again, it's going to be a case by case basis. And then concerted activities, that gets back to companies colluding together to do different types of things that again restrain trade. A lot of cases are international. Okay, a lot of cases are international. Antitrust division, look at that, 90% of criminal fines relate to international cartels. Kind of interesting, right? Most large defendants are foreign-based. They probably form monopolies overseas and then try to use monopoly power here in the U.S. Why does the U.S. have any jurisdiction over those things? Pretty simple. If they want to do business here in the U.S., then they'll have to comply, with those types of laws. The Clayton Act came along in 1914, and again, it's more of a proactive thing. It established the Federal Trade Commission, and a current case, that we talked about, I think, a little bit already is they just announced AT&T and Time Warner are thinking of merging, or actually AT&T by Time Warner, and that's being considered, right? And it's being considered by the Federal Trade Commission. Other agencies might be involved as well because they have some jurisdiction there. The Federal Communications Commission possibly, because that's obviously TV and internet and those types of things. So there are other agencies that might be involved, but the Clayton Act then is kind of proactive. So rather than just say, hey, go ahead and merge, and then we're going to come back later with the Sherman Act and maybe see if you've formed a monopoly that's predatory, etc. We try to instead stop those things from happening in the first place. So when you see big mergers like that, they're going to be subject to review, right? And regulatory review by the Federal Trade Commission at least, and again, other agencies can get involved. So they might refuse to let them merge. We don't know yet with AT&T and Time Warner. Okay, it kind of eased the burden of proof so that we're not in a court situation, and so they don't have to necessarily go beyond a reasonable doubt. The Justice Department can still get involved, right? There can be court injunctions that could stop, mergers and acquisitions from taking place, right? And similar in terms of the damages. So what are some other things that have come along? I mean, the Robinson-Patman Act talks about the quantity purchase advantage, and it really says that small competitors shouldn't have to pay more just because of their size, than the large companies. Large companies shouldn't be able to force them out of business is basically what that amounts to. And to me, I still find this one kind of confusing because I know, I've talked to or listened to a guy that used to work for Sun Mountain Sports quite a bit, and he was kind of bigwig with them, and he had Walmart had called them up and said, hey, we're interested in maybe carrying some of those Sun Mountain products that you have for golf. Why don't you come on down? And he said that it was miserable that Walmart negotiated very, very hard on pricing, okay, and he kind of, it kind of gave me the impression that, they did try to finagle lower prices. And I don't know if that would have been anti-competitive or if Walmart's stance would have been, they should offer those prices then to everybody. Maybe, I don't know. I've never seen any cases that have come up about that or anything. So it does deal with the sale of goods, and again, it can be predatory pricing or an advantageous pricing, for a large, quantity of purchase. So again, this one confuses me a little bit. So, but there are exceptions, and maybe this is what some of these fall on. Good faith transactions to meet competition, right? Or good faith transactions that maybe have cost justification, good faith transactions that due to changing conditions, and the one that we don't have in here would be to, maybe obsolescence of a product. If let me think of a company, Lumber Liquidators. It's called Lumber Liquidators. So maybe they're taking products, that are being cast away. TJ Maxx and Ross, I think, are similar to that. You go to TJ Maxx, and what do you get there, right? They're picking up a lot of obsolete products from manufacturers and whatnot, and then selling them, at discounts there. So again, the Clayton Act, a lot of the same things, right? It's going to come in and say, yeah, we can't have tying contracts, right? You can't. The full line forcing is saying you can't necessarily force, if you're a manufacturer, force a retailer to carry your full line, right? If you've got multiple products over multiple categories and whatnot, you can't necessarily force them then to carry everything. Reciprocal dealing, and these ones here are all kind of related, right? The reciprocal dealing is saying, well, I think the book gives that example. It says, we'll buy the computer components from you, and you buy your computers back from us. Okay, that doesn't mean they can't. Again, these are case-by-case things, and you'd look at it on a case-by-case basis to see if there was predatory actions there or whatnot. I think as long as the purchase back was fair, and market prices and whatnot, there wouldn't be anything wrong with that. So, exclusive dealing, that's where you're forcing. Okay, maybe you're a manufacturer and you force, or you tell the retailer, hey, we only want you to buy from us. We're only going to supply to you. Requirements contracts might be the same thing, maybe shorter periods of time or whatever. But I require that we're going to get all our stuff from you, or the wholesaler, the manufacturer says, hey, you're going to buy only from us for this certain period of time. So they're very similar. I don't know that we need to really distinguish between those. Oops. So again, enforcement, this is important to know, right? More than likely be on the test. The enforcement of the Sherman Act violations go through the Department of Justice. So again, after the fact things, if we see monopolies that have formed, that have been created, the Sherman Act comes in and the Department of Justice gets involved. The Federal Trade Commission gets involved when we talk about the Clayton Act, or before, right? Before we get in there, before things have happened. So types of mergers and acquisitions. So we could have horizontal. Okay, and horizontal here would be two airlines getting together. Vertical. Now this one's interesting, like AT&T and Time Warner. Wow. Yeah, it might be a combination, right? Because they share some services. AT&T, Time Warner provides TV lines and no doubt internet and whatnot in certain areas, certain markets around the country, as does AT&T, and AT&T owns DirecTV. Wow, yeah, it's kind of interesting, if that would be vertical or not. But vertical might be. I was trying to think when NBC bought Comcast, or was it vice versa? I think Comcast bought NBC years ago. NBC being a content maker and a content provider, right? News, movies, shows, those types of things. And Comcast delivers, much like AT&T and Time Warner, it delivers services, cable services, and those types of things to homes. And so that would have been a vertical merger there, right? And that conglomerate, think anything that Berkshire Hathaway does or GE does, really, right? Because they've got so many businesses in so many different areas, that those are conglomerates, they're called. Similar here, right? Types of mergers can be market extension. Okay, it could be geographic, or it could be, kind of like vertical. We're just extending our the same thing with the Comcast and NBC, right? We're extending really what areas we provide in the supply chain. Okay. Again, Federal Trade Commission, they're gonna look at things in terms of if it might create unfair competition, then they're not going to okay it. Enforcement, if the conduct's going to injure consumers, they're not going to allow it. If it offends public policy, they're not going to allow it. If it might conduct oppressive, right, or any of those things, right. And again, its primary function is prevention. And look at the news stories for AT&T, Time Warner, if you want to see some really current stuff that's going on there. This was interesting. At one point in time, Direct and Dish talked about merging, and they ended up abandoning that because it looked like the Federal Trade Commission was going to tell them no. Either the Federal Trade or the FCC was going to tell them no, and so they abandoned that. And interestingly, then DirecTV was bought by AT&T, So I doubt that they're doing that, but a lot of the same arguments. This happened before Sirius and XM were allowed to, and Sirius and XM were allowed to merge, even though it kind of created a monopoly. They're the only satellite radio provider that I know of, right? But they argued successfully that there were lots of other methods of receiving the same stuff, whether it's free radio that we get, or whether it's Pandora, those types of things for music, iTunes, those types of things for music, right? And Direct and Dish would have had really those same arguments because there's lots of cable providers. We're starting to get streaming, Netflix, all those other things. So I have a feeling if they were to try to merge today, they'd probably be more successful. Because look at the growth of Netflix, and most millennials are cutting the cord. They're not they're not buying cable, or they're not buying satellite TV or any of those things. Basically, they're just cutting the cord and going with streaming type services and whatnot. So there you have it, chapter 16.